Hello sim racers and welcome back to the Fixed Setup Oval Racing Guide. We'll be covering week 5 of season 1, which runs from January 11th through the 18th. With road courses in the rearview mirror and all 4 series returning to strictly ovals for a while, we can finally get down to the meat and potatoes of what this series is all about. So, what did you think of all the road course racing over the past few weeks? Did you like it? Let me know down in the comments section below your thoughts on these 4 oval series going to road courses throughout the season. This week, we get a balanced mix of short track chaos and standard 1.5 mile oval racing. Just as a friendly reminder, these episodes will always be timestamped for your convenience, so if you're looking for one series in particular, use the timestamps listed in the description below. And with that said, let's check out this week's races. Before we begin, please take a moment to listen to my disclaimers. As with any skill-based activity, your mileage may vary with the information shared in this video. Sim racing requires individual effort in order to improve, and simply watching a video will not make you a better sim racer. Tips and tricks are not one size fits all, and you may need to adjust based on your skill level. These episodes are recorded before the week begins, so the guided qualifying laps should not be viewed as the gold standard for the best lap time possible. Treat this information simply as a starting point for your own practice routine. Any analysis or commentary that I provide comes from my own experience on iRacing and may not always directly translate to what happens to you. I'm human, I make mistakes, and I can be wrong. I try my best to avoid errors and misinformation, but if I do make a mistake, you have my apology in advance. The ARCA Menard Series heads to Southern National Motorsports Park, a high-banked 0.4 of a mile thrill ride in North Carolina. The race is 60 laps and takes place under the lights at 6:20 p.m. in sim. With a deceptively wide surface and steeply banked corners, this track is easy to get wrong and will surely produce some chaotic races. If you thought last week was nuts at Nashville, this week will probably blow that away. Qualifying here is tough because there's very little grip for a few laps and you gotta hustle this thing to get a good lap time in. For my mock qualifying run, I used a 14:1 steering ratio and 66% brake bias. You may find more speed with 12:1, but I found myself to be more consistent with 14:1. Like last week, start your flying lap by getting a good run off the high side of 3 and 4 to maximize your speed into turn 1. Your turn-in point should be about the second dashed line after the start-finish line. Apply enough brake pressure to get the car turned to the bottom, get off the brakes, and roll into the throttle as much as the car will allow without getting loose. Aim the right front of the car for the missing section of fence on the backstretch as you arc out. The entry to turn 3 will come shortly after this part of the track, and if you miss it, you'll struggle to get to the bottom for a good lap time. Apply enough brake pressure to get the car down to the white line and roll into the throttle as much as the car will allow without getting loose. You'll feel a lot of rear end slip the more aggressively you exit turn 4, so be prepared to counter that with steering input to finish the lap. My lap time was a 14.918. Doing a 10-lap mock race run, I used a 14:1 steering ratio and 67% brake bias. You can try running less brake bias, but with the heavy braking needed at this track, I'd be cautious with that adjustment. Like with qualifying, I found my race pace to be more consistent at 14:1, but you may find 12:1 suits you better. It's easy to overdrive the corners here and miss the bottom. I promise you, nothing good will happen if you find yourself in that middle or upper groove of the track. The entry to turn 3 comes up faster than you think, so back up those corners a little bit to make sure you don't slide up in the turns. 60 laps, no cautions, and nowhere to hide. The perfect recipe for a chaotic, crash-filled race that may provide a lot of entertainment, but stands a good chance of being highly detrimental to your safety rating. I recommend approaching this week's ARCA race with extreme caution, especially if you're trying to get promoted up to a C license. C Fixed goes to Myrtle Beach Speedway, a half-mile, D-shaped track in South Carolina. This track has a rich history in stock car racing and should scratch that short track itch if you're into that style of racing. The race is 60 laps and takes place at 6:25 p.m. in sim. Now, I haven't run a whole lot of laps around this place in the past, but I learned pretty quickly in my testing that this track can be really rewarding when you get it right. For my qualifying run, I used a 14:1 steering ratio and 65% brake bias. You may find a higher brake bias to provide a more secure feeling on corner entry, but remember, it can also extend that braking time, so adjust accordingly. The front stretch at Myrtle Beach reminds me a lot of Richmond, and it's very easy to miss the entry to turn 1 if you're not careful. As you'll see from my telemetry, constant steering wheel input is required all the way down the front stretch. My turn-in point was around the second light pole after the start-finish line. Gradually pull the truck towards the white line, but be careful not to get there too soon. It's imperative to keep momentum up in these trucks, so don't stall out your corner speed trying to wrap the line. Additionally, be careful to stay away from those humps that are coming up from the racetrack. These will absolutely damage your truck if you go over them. Coming out of turn 2, you'll see I struggle to get the power down here, but do your best to get back to full throttle and straight before the red text on the backstretch wall. Setting up for turn 3, I used the last light pole as my turn-in point. Pull the truck towards the very bottom and reduce brake pressure so the truck slides up to the second lane. You should be able to apply generous throttle once the turn 4 wall text appears in front of you. Fight through the low rear grip on exit and cut the front stretch as much as possible to gain a little time. My lap time was a 19.136. One thing I want to touch on here, across all my mock qualifying runs, I found that I could keep better speed through turns 3 and 4 using that second lane as opposed to keeping the truck on the very bottom. In your practice, experiment with your entry to find that perfect balance, but remember, in these trucks, keeping your momentum up is key. For my 10-lap mock race run, I stuck with a 14:1 steering ratio and 65% brake bias, but again, you may find a slightly higher brake bias to be more comfortable. Throttle discipline will be a large part of finding success, largely because it's easy to burn up the rear tires if you're too aggressive on corner exits. Conversely, it's really easy to overshoot turn 1, so I encourage you to back up that corner entry until you're more comfortable with the braking zone. Myrtle Beach Speedway is an old school type of track that has the potential for great racing, but like Richmond, beware the dive bombs going into turn 1 from someone cutting low down that curved front straightaway. Restarts will be chaotic as everybody fights to get to the bottom for turn 1, so stay on your toes, don't be afraid to block, but expect a lot of contact if you do. B Fixed heads to Chicagoland Speedway, a 1.5-mile D-shaped oval in Illinois. The race is 45 laps and takes place at noon in sim. This combination was viewed by many members of the oval racing community as the best week of B Fixed racing in all of 2020 in terms of fun, quality of racing, and overall driving enjoyment. So, did last year's favorite return as another can't-miss experience? I'll touch on that after we look at my qualifying lap. For my run, I used a 16:1 steering ratio and left the brake bias at its default value. As you start your flying lap, dive to the apron and place your car next to the grass right as you reach the start-finish line. Let the car naturally drive itself back up onto the track, and you should be to the middle seam before you reach the red stripe on the wall. Maximize your entry by being flat against the wall until the safer barrier begins, and turn in at the irregular patch of asphalt. If done correctly, you'll be able to briefly lift off of the throttle, aim the car towards the white line, and reapply partial throttle by the time you reach the shadows of the light poles. Get back to full throttle as soon as you can and let the car arc out towards the wall. Let the middle of the car trace the top asphalt seam all the way down that curved backstretch. There's no need to hug the wall, it's only going to cost you time. Start turning in for turn 3 at the last caution light. Like turn 1, jump off the throttle long enough to get the car stuck to the white line. Keep the car on the bottom as best as possible, but beware of a nasty bump that can send your car up the track like it did to me. Beware of the abrupt exit of turn 4 and cut the front stretch apron once again to complete the lap. My lap time was a 30.975. Now to answer the question, is this season's Be Fixed at Chicagoland Speedway the amazing experience it was last year? From what I've experienced and what I've seen in my testing so far, the unfortunate answer is no. What made last year's experience so universally loved was how the car rotated on throttle from mid-corner to exit and didn't feel like a dump truck unless you burned off the right front tire. What I experienced in my solo 10-lap mock race run was a car that didn't have that same feel, lacked the on-throttle rotation that made last year so great, and ended up feeling very snug no matter how much tire saving I did. With a setup that acts like this, I recommend using a 16:1 steering ratio and running a lower brake bias, maybe around 63% to start, with the anticipation of lowering the brake bias in car during the course of a long run if you get one. This week is a perfect combination to take advantage of the tricks and tips I shared in my tire saving video. I'll link that on screen at the end of this episode. A-Fix goes back in time and races at the 2009 version of Texas Motor Speedway, arguably the better version of this mile-and-a-half track. If you've never seen this version of the track before and race A-Fix this week, it just might make you wonder why they ever reconfigured this track. The race is 50 laps and takes place at noon in sim. This race is a prototypical mile-and-a-half, and dirty air will make passing tough with that high downforce, low horsepower package equipped on the Cup cars this week. Qualifying will be important, and thankfully for everyone, it's a really easy lap to do. For my run, I used a 16:1 steering ratio and did not touch the brake bias. You can run wide open both laps, but I recommend using lap 1 to get the tires into their operating window. Use all of the track exiting turn 4 to maximize your speed and set the car up to run as straight as possible through the double dogleg. Set up for turn 1 by pointing the right front towards the Texas text and be flat against the wall at that point. Pull the car to the white line and keep it there as long as you can. Don't worry, the car will bite in the center of the corner and keep turning. You will not get tight. Let the car arc out towards the wall coming out of 2 and hold the wall down the backstretch. Line up your entry into 3 so the car points to the bottom with minimal steering wheel input. Hold the bottom all the way through and exit turn 4 so the center of the car is straddling the upper dashed line. Cut the dogleg as tight as possible to finish the lap. My lap time was a 28.987. This is the sort of race where you have a great chance of finding success if you can start up front. With so much on-throttle time, these races will come down to mistakes and overdriving, so be mindful of your speed as you ride behind others. For my 10-lap mock race run, I kept the 16:1 steering ratio and also left the brake bias at its default value. I could easily run wide open every lap, but that won't be the case once the draft comes into play from other cars. If you're the leader, you may be able to get away with it because of clean air on your nose and the dirty air you're passing off to the cars behind you. Don't give up the bottom, and you should be just fine at the older, better version of Texas Motor Speedway. Best of luck mixing it up out there in Week 5, whether you brave the short track mayhem of ARCA and C Fixed or participate in the parades of Chicago and Texas. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode and found the information to be educational, but most importantly, helpful. If it was, please leave a thumbs up, and if it wasn't, a thumbs down so I know to do better next time. If you want to see more iRacing content similar to this, make sure you hit the subscribe button and turn notifications on so that you never miss an episode. Additionally, you can catch me live streaming iRacing on my Twitch channel, linked down in the description below. If you want to get in touch with me and stay up to date on the latest channel activity, the best way to do that is to follow me on Twitter, also linked down in the description below. Again, thank you so much for watching this video, and have a great week of racing.